RMS Queen Elizabeth is the baby sister of RMS Queen Mary, a famous ocean liner that still exists to this day as a museum ship in Long Beach. The latter sailed on her maiden voyage on May 27, 1936, and it was this day that Cunard's chairman, Sir Percy Bates, informed his ship designers to start planning a second ship. The official contract between the government financiers and Cunard was signed on October 6, 1936. This isn't the first time the Admiralty has contracted Cunard Line to build their ships with the possibility of military conversion in mind. If we think back to Lusitania and Mauretania, they were also built for the same purpose back at the turn of the century. The new ship, RMS Queen Elizabeth, was built as an improvement from Queen Mary. She was built on Slipway 4 at John Brown & Company in Clydebank, Scotland, and during construction, she was known as Hull 552. She was laid down on December 4, 1936, launched on September 27, 1938, and she would sit at the fitting-out dock at the shipyard in Cunard livery until November 2, 1939, 2 months after England had declared war on Germany following Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. The Ministry of Shipping issued special licenses to declare her seaworthy. On December 29th, the engines were tested. 2 months later, Cunard received a letter from Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, ordering the ship to leave Clydeside as soon as possible and to, quote, keep away from the British Isles as long as the order was in force. At the start of World War II, Queen Elizabeth was so vital that it was crucial that German spies not track her movements. An elaborate ruse suggested to any German observers that she would sail to Southampton to complete her fitting out. Another factor prompting her departure was the necessity to clear the fitting out berth at the shipyard for the battleship HMS Duke of York for final fitting out, as only it could accommodate the massive King George V class battleships. One major factor that limited the ship's departure date was that there were only 2 spring tides that year high enough for Queen Elizabeth to leave the Clydebank shipyard, also known by German intelligence. A minimal crew of 400 were assigned for the trip. Most were transferred from Aquitania and told that this would be a short coastal voyage to Southampton, but to pack for 6 months. Parts were shipped to Southampton and preparations were made to move the ship into the King George V graving dock when she arrived. By the beginning of March 1940, Queen Elizabeth was ready to move. She'd been fueled and she'd been painted battleship gray. On the morning of March 3rd, she quietly crept from her moorings in the Clyde and proceeded out to the river, where she was met by a king's messenger, who presented sealed orders directly to the captain. They were to book it across the Atlantic to New York City in the then-neutral United States, without even a stop in Southampton to drop off the harbor pilot they'd scooped up, and to maintain utter radio silence. Later that day, when she was due to arrive at Southampton, the city was bombed by the Luftwaffe, but Queen Elizabeth was out at sea. She zigzagged across the Atlantic to avoid German U-boats and took 6 days to reach New York at an average speed of 26 knots. There, she found herself moored alongside Queen Mary and the French line's Normandy, the only time the world's 3 largest ocean liners were ever berthed together. Aquitania would later join them. 3 ships stayed together for 2 weeks before Queen Mary departed for Sydney, Australia. Queen Elizabeth was secured so that no one could board her without prior permission, including port officials. She left New York on November 13, 1940, for Singapore to receive her troopship conversion. After 2 stops to refuel and replenish her stores in Trinidad and Cape Town, she arrived in Singapore's naval docks, where she was fitted with anti-aircraft guns and her hull repainted gray. Queen Elizabeth left Singapore on February 11, 1941, and on February 23, 1942, she secretly arrived in Esquimalt, British Columbia, Canada. She underwent refit work in dry dock, adding accommodation and armaments, and 300 naval ratings quickly painted the hull again. In mid-March, carrying 8,000 American soldiers, Queen Elizabeth began a 7,700-mile voyage from San Francisco to Sydney, Australia. She then carried Australian troops to theaters of operation in Asia and Africa. After 1942, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth were relocated to the North Atlantic for the transportation of American troops to Europe. Their high speeds allowed them to outrun hazards, principally German U-boats, usually allowing them to travel outside a convoy and without escort. Nevertheless, Queen Elizabeth was the target of U-704, which fired 4 torpedoes at her on November 9, 1942. The commander, Horst Wilhelm Kessler, heard a detonation and Nazi radio propaganda celebrated her sinking. In reality, one of the torpedoes had prematurely detonated and Queen Elizabeth was unharmed. During her wartime service, Queen Elizabeth carried more than 750,000 troops and sailed some 500,000 miles. That means in that distance, she could have traveled around the world 20 times. If you are enjoying the video, make sure to subscribe, leave me a like, and let me know in the comments section. Following the end of World War II, Queen Elizabeth was refitted and refurnished as the ocean liner she was always meant to be, while her running mate Queen Mary continued in her wartime role and gray appearance except for her funnels, which were repainted in Cunard colors. For another year, Queen Mary was busy returning troops and war brides to the US while Queen Elizabeth was overhauled. 6 years of war service had never permitted her formal sea trials to take place, so these were held now. Cunard Commodore Sir James Bassett was at the helm, and he was under strange and strict commands from Sir Percy Bates that all was required from the ship was 2 measured runs of no more than 30 knots, and that she was not to attempt to attain a higher speed than Queen Mary. Her engines, however, were capable of driving her to speeds of over 32 knots. After her trials, she finally entered passenger service, allowing Cunard White Star to launch the long-planned 2-ship weekly service to New York. Despite the fact she did very well and could have attained it, she never held the blue ribbon, as Percy Bates did not want Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth to compete against one another. She did have a couple minor hiccups as she ran aground on a sandbank off Southampton on April 14, 1947, and was refloated the following day. Following a refit that added stabilizers underwater on July 29, 1959, she was in a collision with the American freighter American Hunter in foggy conditions in New York Harbor and was holed above the waterline. Together with Queen Mary and in competition with the American liners SS United States and SS America, Queen Elizabeth dominated the transatlantic passenger trade until their fortunes began to decline with the advent of the faster and more economical jet airliner in the late 1950s. As passenger numbers declined, the liners became uneconomic to operate in the face of rising fuel and labor costs. For a short time, the Queen Elizabeth, then under the command of Commodore Geoffrey Tripleton Marr, attempted a dual role of alternating her usual transatlantic route with cruising between New York and Nassau. For this new tropical excursion, the ship received a major refit in 1965, with a new Lido deck added to her aft section, enhanced air conditioning, and an outdoor swimming pool. With these improvements, Cunard intended to keep the ship in operation until at least the mid-1970s. However, the strategy did not prove successful, owing to the ship's deep draft, which prevented her from entering various island ports and high fuel costs. She was also too wide for transiting the Panama Canal, limiting travel to the Pacific. Cunard retired Queen Mary in 1967 and Queen Elizabeth upon her final Atlantic crossing to New York on November 5, 1968. The 2 liners were replaced with the new, smaller, more economical Queen Elizabeth II. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. In late 1968, Queen Elizabeth was sold to the Elizabeth Corporation, with 15% of the company controlled by a group of Philadelphia businessmen and 85% retained by Cunard. The new company intended to operate the ship as a hotel and tourist attraction in Port Everglades, Florida, similar to the planned use of Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. Elizabeth, as she was now called, arrived in Port Everglades on December 8, 1968, and opened to tourists in February 1969, well before Queen Mary, which opened 2 years later in 1971. The vessel was sold to Queen Limited of Port Everglades on July 19, 1969. However, Queen Elizabeth's retirement in Florida wasn't meant to be. The climate of southern Florida was much harder on the ship than the climate of southern California was on Queen Mary. There was some talk of permanently flooding the bilge and allowing Queen Elizabeth to rest on the bed of the Intercoastal Waterway and Fort Lauderdale Harbor and remain open, but the ship was forced to close in August of 1970, after losing money and being declared a fire hazard. The vessel was sold at auction in 1970 to Hong Kong tycoon Tung Chao-yung. Tung, the head of the Orient Overseas Line, intended to convert the vessel into a University of the World Campus Afloat program, later reformed and renamed as Semester at Sea. Following the tradition of the Orient Overseas Line, the ship was renamed Seawise University. The ship was under Hong Kong ownership and sailed for Hong Kong on February 10, 1971. This was ill-advised, as the ship's engines and boilers were in poor condition after several years of neglect. The retired Commodore Marr and a former chief engineer of the ship were hired by Tung as advisors for the journey to Hong Kong. Marr recommended that Seawise University be towed to the new territories, but Tung and his crew were convinced that they could get there using just the aft engines and boilers. The planned several-week trip turned into months as the crew battled with boiler issues and a fire. An unplanned lengthy mid-voyage stopover allowed the new owners to fly spare parts out to the ship and carry out repairs before resuming course, arriving in Hong Kong harbor in July of 1971. With the £5 million conversion nearing completion, the vessel caught fire on January 9, 1972. These fires were set deliberately, as several blazes broke out simultaneously throughout the ship, and a later court of inquiry handed down a cause of arson by person or persons unknown. The fact that Tung had acquired the vessel for $3.5 million and had insured it for $8 million led some to speculate that the inferno was part of a fraud to collect on the insurance claim. Others speculated that the fires were the result of a conflict between Tung, a Chinese nationalist, and communist-dominated ship construction unions. The once great ocean liner rolled on her side from the water sprayed on her by fireboats, then settled on the bottom of Victoria Harbor. Prior to scrapping, her wreck was featured in the 1974 James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun as a covert headquarters for MI6. The vessel was finally declared a shipping hazard and dismantled for scrap between December 1974 and 1975. Portions of the hull that were not salvaged, as well as the keel, boilers, and engines, remained at the bottom of the harbor, and the area was marked as foul on local sea charts, warning ships not to try to anchor there. It is estimated that around 40 to 50% of the wreck was still on the seabed. In the late 1990s, the last remains of the wreck were buried during land reclamation for the construction of Container Terminal 9. After the fire, Tung had one of the liner's anchors and the metal letters Q and E from the name on the bow placed in front of the office building at Del Amo Fashion Center in Torrance, California, which had been intended as the headquarters of the Seawise University venture. They later went on display with commemorative plaques, and the ship's fire warning system brass plaques were recovered by a dredger and were displayed at the Aberdeen Boat Club in Hong Kong in an exhibit about the ship. The charred remnants of her last ensign were cut from the flagpole and framed in 1972, and still adorn the wall of the officers' mess of Marine Police HQ in Hong Kong. Parker Pen Company produced a special edition of 5,000 pens made from material recovered from the wreck, each in a presentation box. Today, these are highly collectible. Following the demise of Queen Elizabeth, the largest passenger ship in active service became the 63,343 gross register ton SS France, which was longer but with less tonnage than the Cunard liner. Queen Elizabeth held the record of the largest passenger ship ever built until the 101,353 gross ton Carnival Destiny, later Carnival Sunshine, was launched in 1996. To date, Queen Elizabeth still holds the record as the largest passenger ship for the longest period of time, 56 years. She had an incredible run that ended in fiery tragedy.